In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 3 of your textbook, Architecture. Now, when we talk about architecture, architecture is a little different than the other art forms we've looked at. Why? Because unlike two-dimensional art or sculpture, architecture usually has to serve some sort of function. The textbook defines architecture as the art of sheltering. And now remember, when we look at architecture, we're not just talking about buildings. We can be talking about some very large sculptures, bridges, triumphant arches, anything honestly that can act as a shelter. Now, back to the idea of when we look at architecture as having some other purpose. For example, the image that you see here. This is actually the Guggenheim Museum that's in Bilbao, Spain, and it was designed by American architect Frank Gehry. Well, architects have to take in consideration not just how the building will look, but the intended purpose for the building. So this building is an art museum. So think about all the things that are necessary for an art museum. You have to have plenty of wall space in which to hang art up on. You also have a lot of open space to put sculptures or installation art. You have to have areas where people can walk through. You have to have stairs. You have to have elevators. You have to have bathrooms. These are all things architects have to think about. What if this structure, the only doorways were a regular sized doorway, 2.5 feet by 7 feet? Well, what happens if you have large pieces of art? They would be impractical. You couldn't fit it in there. So with architects, we have to look at a combination of functionality and the aesthetic creation behind the building. Usually, function trumps beauty, but hold on to that idea because we'll talk about that at the end of the chapter. First, we're going to look at different ways of how we look at art. And your textbook goes through 10 fundamental elements. Before we go through those, this image, this is actually the Guggenheim Museum in New York City, and this was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. On the next slide, you'll see the Guggenheim in New York City from the outside. So the 10 fundamental elements that we look at when we are studying architecture: structure, building materials, line, repetition, balance, scale, proportion, context, space, and climate. First is structure. Structure pretty much simply means how it is built or supported. And here you can see some of the main ways of structuring a building: the post and lintel system, the arch, cantilever, bearing wall, and skeletal frame. The first we're going to look at is what's called the post and lintel. This is where you have horizontal beams, which are the lintel, that are laid across open spaces between columns, some sort of vertical support. And again, they are traditionally columns, and traditionally the post and lintel systems are made out of stone. This was very popular when you think of ancient Greek architecture. Think of the Acropolis. Think of the Parthenon on the Acropolis. Here, the reason why these buildings are traditionally stone is because they have to have a strong tensile strength, meaning they have to withstand bending. If you created these structures with wood, what happens with wood over time? It begins to warp and it begins to bend. Therefore, your structure would fall apart. So that's why we traditionally have them created with stone. Here, what we can do, we can look at some of the basic Greek orders, and this is what I have you see here: the Doric, the Ionic, and the Corinthian. The way we tell these apart is each of the three we see the shaft of the column. How you tell the three apart is you look at the bottoms and you look at the top. At the top, you have what's called the capital, and that's the top part of the pillar or the column, and it's the transition between the column and the lintel, meaning the horizontal beam again. And now if you look at the image on the far left or on the right hand side, there's just the capital shown. The first is what's called the Doric. It is the earliest and most basic form. There's very little to no ornamentation. The columns are very heavy, and at the base, look at the foot of the column, there is no base at all. The column just goes straight to the floor. The next is what's called the Ionic. These are shown by the scroll shapes on either side of the capital. These are called volutes. Now, the Ionic will only have that scroll shape. And then if you look at the bottom, you can see there is a base. And then finally, we have what's called the Corinthian. This is the newest of the three Greek orders, and it's the most ornate. And what you have with this is you usually have more slender fluted columns. The fluting are the ridges in the columns. And what happens is the capital, if you look at it, it's almost an upside down bell shape. Usually these are heavily decorated and usually with some type of leaf on them. Now, just to warn you, Corinthian capitals can also be topped with the volutes, the scroll work that's on Ionic. But how you tell them apart, the Corinthian, even if there is that scroll work, you're still going to have the bell-shaped capital that has other decoration on it. The Ionic only has the volutes. All right, here's some more examples of this post and lintel system. Here you can see with the frieze and the architrave, that's the lintel system. The column is our post. I won't give you a blank one of these on a test, but I'd be aware of parts of them. The frieze, where you can see again on the lintel, this is usually a decorated part. Think again about the Parthenon. The Parthenon friezes were the relief sculptures that went all the way around. The pediment, here we see it's a half-cut triangle because we're only seeing a part of the building. The pediment would be that large triangular shape on the top. The entablature is the upper portion of a classical architectural order. It's the one right above the column, below the frieze. Okay. Then we have the cornice. A cornice is an ornamental molding that's usually around the wall of a room or a building, and it's just below the ceiling. And then a lot of these, we see them in modern architecture in what's called a portico. This is an outdoor covered porch. So it's a roof supported by columns at irregular intervals. Typically, again, it's a porch attached to some building. So look at this, familiarize yourself with it, but again, I won't give you a blank screen asking you to fill these in. I would make sure, though, I knew the difference between the three of these. All right, next we're going to look at the arch. The arch developed in Rome, and this drastically changed architecture. Why? Because arches can define large spaces and allows the stress to transfer outwards from the center, from the keystone that you see here, to its legs. The legs usually form columns, door jambs, windows, or piers. Now, arches, unlike the post and lintel system, do not depend on the tensile strength of materials used. They don't have to withstand this not bending because an arch, by definition, is bent. Okay? Different arches can be both for structural purposes and decorative purposes. So here in the upper right, you see the Gothic arch, and that's that pointed arch. Well, with a Gothic arch, you can go much higher into spaces, and you can very drastically go downwards, pushing the thrust that way. The large arch on the left here is the Roman arch, or the horseshoe arch. If I were you, I would know the different types of arches, but refer more to on page 85 of your textbook. There are 6 main types of arches. All right, so now with arches, we can do different things with these. When you put arches beside each other, side by side, think like creating an M. This is called an arcade. When we put arches back to back, we have what's called the tunnel vault, or here you see in the upper left, this is called a barrel vault. Again, this can help create a very large open space. This is also often used in hallways. We have what's called a groin vault, which you see in the upper right. This is when 2 tunnel vaults or barrel vaults intersect at right angles. We also have what's called rib vaulting. You see that in the lower left. This is actually where you have protruding masonry, indicating some sort of diagonal juncture. Usually the rib vaults are on the outside to add additional support. And then one of the most important aspects of the arch is the dome. Think about domes. Domes are arches that are joined at the top and they go in a circular form and their legs form a circle, and which gives us a very large wide open space. Think of the Pantheon in Rome. All right, next we're going to look at what's called the cantilever. The cantilever is a structural system in which an overhanging beam is supported only at one end. Now, this can be either overhead or it can be a floor. This was used in the 19th century, but it became more popular in the 20th century, especially with the development of materials such as steel beams and pre-stressed concrete. Because think about this. If you had a structure and you were only supporting at one end, if it was completely wood, again, over time, it would probably start to bend and sag. This image here, this is a house called Fallingwater, and it was created by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1935. Here you can see the very famous cantilevering. You can see part of it is a roof if you're on a lower level, or it works as the floor. And so what happens in this is that you actually become part of the surrounding area because you don't have supporting walls on either side. Please, I've attached a short little 5-minute YouTube video. This was a segment on Sunday morning, but you get some really, really excellent views of Fallingwater. So please watch it so you can pay attention to the cantilevering there. Next, we have what's called the bearing wall. The bearing wall, this is what most of us are used to. The bearing wall is the one, it bears the burden of holding up the building. The wall supports itself, the floor, and the roof. Examples, these are log cabins and most masonry buildings, meaning brick buildings. And then finally, the skeleton frame. This should be very familiar to us. Most of our homes are created this way. Skyscrapers are created this way. And what happens in the skeleton frame, it's a skeleton just like we have in our systems. There is a framework that supports the building. The walls are attached to the frame. These can be made from steel. These can be made from wood. Okay, so steel cage construction can withstand heavy, heavy pressures. The metal frame, these are often used in buildings such as skyscrapers. All right, the next thing that we're going to look at are the building materials. What is actually used to create it? Again, with stone, masonry construction, stone combined with mortar. This is an example of a brick wall. We've already talked about this, was very popular in the post and lintel system. Concrete. Concrete was actually used as far back as ancient Rome, but there have been many, many advances made in concrete, such as it is pre-stressed, pre-cast, and concrete that actually has steel beams running through it to give it even more support. Okay. Wood is a very popular building source. Why? It's a renewable resource and it's very popular in housing framework. Now, wood is not as strong as steel, but why don't we use steel in the construction of our houses? Because it's too expensive. Wood is a much cheaper option. And then finally, steel. Steel is an almost limitless possibilities. For example, the image you see here. This is what's called a geodesic dome. Geodesic domes were invented by the American architect Richard Buckminster Fuller. And what you have is you have a network of metal rods and hexagonal plates. And then this metal system is then covered with some sort of material. This geodesic dome is probably one of the most famous in the world. This is the geodesic dome at Epcot Center in Florida. Okay, now let's look at some of your elements and principles of composition. First, let's start with line, repetition, and balance. The image that you're looking at here, this building is Hampton Court Palace in England. It was designed by Christopher Wren and it was constructed in 1689. This is a great example of how you could talk about line. There are many different ways. Look at the different levels of the buildings. Even though each floor is a different size, look how each window, the windows on them all match, creating almost horizontal lines. And then between the second and the third level, we actually do have a line that goes across the building. And then up and down through the different types of windows, on all three levels going vertically, you have a type of line that's created. Look at the line that help creates linear perspective here. Here, the gardens were designed as part of the structure, and so it tells us where the most important part is. If you were walking up to this building, you would know where you were supposed to go. Repetition plays a very large key in this work. There are many things that are repeated. On each level, the windows are all the same. Even in the gardens, the spacing of the trees and the type of trees are all part of this design. And then we can talk about this work. It's very balanced. The only part of it that's really not balanced is on top. You see all these different chimneys. Some of these were actually added later on. If we folded this building in half, it's actually very symmetrical. And also, look at the reflection of the building in the pool. Again, this was designed as part of the plan to help you see this balance. It actually makes the building seem even larger than it is. All right, next let's talk about scale and proportion. In architecture, when we are talking about scale, we are talking about a building size and the relationship of the building and its decorative elements to the human form, right? So scale is the building and its decorative elements in relationship to the human form. This building that you're looking at here is called Burj Khalifa. This is in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And this is actually the tallest man-made structure in the world. So if we were going to talk about it in scale, we're talking about it in comparison to the human form. So this is in a very, very large scale. Now, when we talk about proportion in architecture, we're talking about the relationship of the individual elements to each other, right? Both affect the building's visual effects. Next, let's look at context. When we are looking at context in architecture, we're usually talking about the surrounding area. And usually the surrounding area is taken into the original design plan because unlike a painting or a sculpture, it's very hard to move a building. Okay? Usually this can help the structure either blend in or stand out. And these are two different examples you see here. Again, the image on the right is Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. Part of his idea with this is that Frank Lloyd Wright often wanted his works to blend into its natural surrounding. The waterfalls that Falling Water is built around are natural. He did not create those, but he created the house around it. When you look at the stones that are reused in creating the house, they're the same type of stones that are naturally occurring in the surrounding area. Now this is very different from the image that you see on the left. This is a Gothic cathedral. Gothic cathedrals were the center of the town and they were meant to be the showcase, so they were meant to stand out. So the Gothic cathedral here, you see it's up high on a hill that makes it stand out, and then it's large size. Also, you would see this from miles around, and that was part of the intent, that travelers in the Middle Ages could see these great cathedrals and they know there would be a place where they could get shelter and probably food. All right, next we're going to talk about space. In architecture, it refers to the design and the flow of the continuous space and its relative function, meaning does it do what it's supposed to do? This is seen very easily when functions are not intended for the space. Move in there. For example, if you are building a baseball stadium, you need to have certain size. A baseball stadium could not just go and move to a tennis court. That would not function. The space would not work. If you created a football stadium and there was only room for a 50-yard field, again, it would not function. Now, this house that we see here is an example of this idea of space. This is what's called Farnsworth House. It's actually it was originally outside of Chicago, and it was designed by Ludwig Miles van der Rohe, 1945 to 1951. This is a home. This is meant as a private home. When you look at it right here, you can see many of the curtains are drawn. However, this house, all of the walls, exterior walls, are made of glass. So if the curtains were all open, you could see through this building. Only on the very interior in the bathroom do you not have it exposed. Well, when this house was originally constructed, it was on a very private plot of land. There were just trees around and no neighbors. Well, as Chicago expanded, more of the land sold, and now you have more neighbors. For those of us who aren't exhibitionists, this probably isn't a very functional house anymore. Most of us would not want to live fully exposed so anybody walking by who could see. Additionally, interesting enough, there's a small creek that also runs by this house. That's why it's originally up on those pillars. However, every year this creek always floods and the house itself has become flooded many, many times. So for this, the space that it's in is no longer usable. It's not used for its intended purpose. Next in architecture, the climate usually plays a role. The climate, we're referring to more of the environmental needs. So if you're in a desert area, you are in a very, very hot environment. You're probably going to have fewer windows to let in the light because you're already very hot. Building materials are also very important. If you're in a very hot climate, you do not want a building material that is going to trap and store the heat. The exact opposite is true if you're in a very cold environment. You do want something that's going to keep the heat in. And this structure here is an example of paying attention to the climate. Because what happens naturally when we go below ground about 6 feet, we start getting at a very common temperature. So if you're in a very hot area, if the ground is solid enough, you could actually build into the ground to create your house like you see here. These kind of look like the Hobbit houses, right? But they're almost always going to have a very steady temperature of about 60 degrees inside. Also, with climate, you have to be very aware of what you're building on. If you're in a very sandy environment, it's not going to be very stable. Or if you're in an environment with a lot of rock or a lot of clay, it's going to be very hard to put down stable, deep, stable foundations for very large and tall structures. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about with architecture is this idea of form follows function, or art for art's sake. Now, we've already talked about architecture usually has some sort of function. It's got some intended purpose for it. We build a football stadium to hold football games. The Guggenheim museums you saw at the beginning were built to hold art. So what happens is that we had Louis Sullivan, who was an architect. In fact, he was Frank Lloyd Wright's mentor. And what he said is that the form must follow the function, meaning that an architect must first think about what is the designed purpose of the building. So this structure that we see here, this is actually the Walt Disney Concert Hall in Los Angeles. This was also designed by Frank Gehry, who designed the first structure that we looked at, the Guggenheim in Bilbao, Spain. Here, the form has to follow the function, meaning this is designed as a concert hall. So what are some things we have to have in a concert hall? Well, number one, we have to have an area large enough that we can put in who's ever performing in a large audience. We have to pay attention to things such as like acoustics, functional things such as getting people in and out safely, bathrooms, concessions, being able to get large pieces of equipment in and out. All of those things must come first, according to Louis Sullivan. He says after that, then the form can follow. Now, you can still have a beautiful structure, but it must function for what it's intended to. So you can see here with the Walt Disney Concert Hall, it's a very beautiful building. It's very sculptural. But Sullivan says it must first be a functioning concert hall. Now, the opposite idea is what's called aestheticism, or art for art's sake. Aestheticism says art has no other purpose than to be beautiful. So for somebody studying aesthetics, they would say, well, it doesn't matter if this building can hold a concert in it. What matters is that this building is aesthetically pleasing, that we find it beautiful. Now, these are two different theories on art. With architecture, you can probably figure out which one's the most popular. Because if you're an architect who constantly builds beautiful buildings but they do not function for their intended purpose, you're probably not going to get hired a lot. Why? Because when people are building and designing structures, they have a function in mind, and if that function does not work, then you've wasted time and money. However, again, the aesthetics, people following aestheticism would say that doesn't matter as long as the structure is beautiful. That's what's important in the work. And then finally, I want to leave you again with the Walt Disney Concert Hall. This is the exterior, and in this image, you can see the interior. So again, form follows function in this design. It's still very aesthetically pleasing. It looks like a warm, inviting place, lots of chairs, but when Gary designed this, he took first in mind the function, that it had to be a successful concert hall. That concludes our lecture on architecture. Again, this was meant to supplement your reading, so please be sure to read the chapter.